He fixed engines all day, never spoke about the war, wore the same oil-stained coveralls for 15 years. The town called him just Old Pete. But when the helicopter crashed on Highway 9 and 3 people were trapped inside, everyone watched him run toward the wreckage like he'd done it 1,000 times before. That's when they realized the man fixing their trucks had once pulled soldiers from burning aircraft in Afghanistan. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of silent skill and forgotten heroism, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like Pete's deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. The garage sat on the edge of Millbrook, sandwiched between a used car lot and a diner that had seen better decades. Peterson's Auto Repair had been there longer than most people could remember, but nobody really paid attention to it until their car broke down. The sign out front was faded, the paint on the building was peeling, and the man who ran it seemed just as weathered as everything else. Pete Peterson, though nobody was sure if Peterson was really his last name, had owned the place for 15 years. He was maybe 60, maybe older, with calloused hands that could diagnose an engine problem just by touch and gray hair that stuck out from under an old baseball cap. He wore the same navy blue coveralls every day, washed but permanently stained with oil and grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The locals brought their vehicles to Pete because he was honest, and his prices were fair. He never overcharged, never recommended unnecessary repairs, and somehow always had the right part in stock or could fabricate one from scrap metal. But Pete wasn't much for conversation. He'd nod when customers walked in, listen to their problem, quote a price, and get to work. No small talk, no weather commentary, no asking about family. The younger mechanics in town thought Pete was just another old-timer who'd been left behind by modern technology. They had computerized diagnostic equipment, manufacturer training certifications, and tablets loaded with technical manuals. Pete had a toolbox older than some of their fathers and an ear that could identify problems they needed machines to detect. Old school, they'd say, with a mixture of condescension and amusement. Probably never even used a computer. What they didn't know was that Pete had once troubleshot avionics systems worth more than their entire shops, in conditions where a mistake meant people died. Jake Martinez was one of those younger mechanics, fresh out of trade school, eager to prove himself, working at Henderson's Auto across town, the big operation with the fancy equipment and the corporate backing. Jake was good at his job, but he was also 23, and full of the kind of confidence that comes from thinking you know everything. It was Jake who started the running joke about Pete. "Bet you $10 the old man doesn't even know what OBD2 stands for," he'd say to the other guys during lunch breaks. They'd laugh and speculate about whether Pete had ever worked on anything built after 1985. The truth was, Pete knew exactly what they thought of him. He'd catch fragments of their conversations when they'd drive past his shop with their windows down, radio blasting. He didn't care. He'd stopped caring about other people's opinions a long time ago, somewhere between his 3rd deployment and the day he'd decided he was done being a soldier. Pete's routine never varied. Open at 7, work until 6, close up and drive home to the small apartment he rented above the hardware store. He ate dinner alone, watched the news, and went to bed early. Weekends were for restocking parts and doing the paperwork he avoided during the week. He had no family that anyone knew of, no friends who stopped by to chat, no hobbies that took him away from the garage. The closest thing Pete had to a social life was his interactions with Mrs. Rodriguez, who brought her ancient Buick in for oil changes and always paid with exact change counted out from a coffee can. She was one of the few people who seemed to actually see him, not just the service he provided. "You take care of yourself, Pete," she'd say every time she left. "A man needs more than work." Pete would nod and smile, a rare expression for him, but he never took her advice. Work was enough. Work was safe. Work didn't ask questions about where he'd been or why he'd ended up in a town where nobody knew his real story. The garage became Pete's sanctuary, A place where the only problems were mechanical ones that could be solved with the right tools and enough patience. Engine troubles didn't give him nightmares. Transmission failures didn't make him wake up in cold sweats. When he was under the hood of a truck, hands deep in machinery, he could almost forget about the other machines he'd worked on, the ones that flew into hostile territory carrying men who trusted him to bring them home. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. Pete was working on a timing belt replacement for a local delivery company when he heard the sound, a deep, rhythmic thumping that made him freeze with his wrench halfway to a bolt. Helicopter. The sound was coming from the south, growing louder, but something was wrong with the rhythm. Pete had heard thousands of helicopters in his life, and this one was struggling. The beat was irregular, stressed, the engine note higher than it should be. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked up. A white medical helicopter was approaching the highway that ran past his garage, flying lower than normal, and at an angle that made Pete's stomach tighten. He could see smoke trailing from the tail rotor assembly. "Come on," Pete whispered, watching the aircraft fight to maintain control. "Come on, you can make it." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't going to make it. The pilot was good. Pete could tell by the way he was managing the failing systems, the controlled descent, the attempt to reach the open field beyond the highway. But good wasn't going to be enough, not with a tail rotor failure at that altitude and speed. The helicopter hit the ground hard about 300 yards from Pete's garage, just off Highway 9. It bounced once, spun sideways, and came to rest on its side in a cloud of dust and debris. Pete was already running before the dust settled. Traffic on the highway had stopped. Drivers were getting out of their cars, some reaching for their phones, others just standing and staring. A few were walking toward the crash site, but slowly, uncertain of what they should do. Pete wasn't uncertain. He ran straight toward the wreckage with the kind of focused urgency that comes from training and experience. His mind had automatically shifted into crisis mode, assessing the situation as he approached. Aircraft down, unknown casualties, potential fire hazard, need for immediate medical attention and evacuation. The helicopter was a BK-117, twin-engine medical transport. Pete could see that the main rotor had separated on impact, and the tail boom was twisted but intact. Fuel was leaking from a ruptured tank, creating a rainbow sheen on the ground, but no fire yet. The cockpit was partially crushed, but the cabin appeared relatively intact. As Pete reached the aircraft, he could hear voices inside, conscious survivors, which was a good sign. He circled the helicopter quickly, looking for the best access point, checking for immediate hazards, mentally cataloging what he was seeing. "Help!" a voice called from inside. "Somebody help us!" Pete found a clear path to the cabin door and yanked on the handle. It was jammed. He braced his foot against the fuselage and pulled harder, using leverage and body weight until the warped metal gave way with a screech of protest. The cabin was a mess of loose equipment and medical supplies, but Pete could see 3 people inside. The pilot, slumped forward in his harness but moving, a flight medic trapped under a loose stretcher, and a patient, an elderly man strapped to a backboard, unconscious but breathing. "I'm here," Pete called into the cabin. "I'm going to get you out." The flight medic looked up at him, blood running from a cut on his forehead. "The patient. We need to get him out first. He was critical when we loaded him." Pete was already moving, climbing partway into the cabin to assess the situation. The patient was secure on the backboard, but the stretcher mechanism was damaged. Pete could see that the man was breathing, but his color wasn't good. "What's his condition?" Pete asked, beginning to work on freeing the stretcher. "Cardiac episode," the medic replied. "We were taking him to regional, but—" He gestured helplessly at the wreckage around them. Pete nodded, his hands working quickly to release the damaged stretcher clamps. "I need you to stay with him while I get this equipment clear. Can you do that?" The medic looked surprised by Pete's calm authority, but nodded. "Yeah, I can do that." And behind them, Pete could hear more voices. Other people arriving at the crash site, someone shouting about calling 911, general confusion and panic. But Pete tuned it out, focusing entirely on the task at hand. He'd been in worse situations with higher stakes and fewer resources. Working with careful efficiency, Pete cleared the loose equipment and debris from around the patient, then began the delicate process of extracting the stretcher from the twisted cabin. It was like working inside a damaged aircraft fuselage, which was exactly what it was, and Pete's hands moved with the practiced competence of someone who'd done this before. "Who are you?" the flight medic asked as they worked together to stabilize the patient during the extraction. "Just a mechanic," Pete replied, never taking his eyes off his work, but the medic was experienced enough to recognize that mechanics didn't usually know how to perform combat extractions from downed aircraft. They didn't typically remain calm under pressure or demonstrate the kind of systematic approach Pete was using, and they definitely didn't know advanced patient handling techniques. It took Pete and the medic 15 minutes to safely extract the patient from the helicopter and get him stable on the ground. By then, a crowd had gathered and sirens could be heard in the distance. Fire department, ambulance, probably police. But Pete wasn't finished. The pilot was still trapped in the cockpit, conscious but unable to move due to a damaged restraint system and possible leg injury. Pete left the patient with the medic and moved to the front of the aircraft. "What's your name?" Pete called to the pilot as he assessed the cockpit damage. "Thompson," the pilot replied through gritted teeth. "Tom Thompson. Listen, the fuel leak." "I see it," Pete said. "We're going to get you out before it becomes a problem." The cockpit was more severely damaged than the cabin, with the instrument panel partially collapsed and the pilot's seat twisted off its mount. Pete could see that Thompson's left leg was pinned but not visibly injured. The restraint system had jammed during the impact. Pete climbed onto the nose of the helicopter to get better access to the cockpit. From that position, he could work on the restraint mechanism while keeping an eye on the fuel leak and monitoring Thompson's condition. "You military?" Thompson asked as Pete worked on freeing him. Pete paused for just a moment. "Used to be." "Thought so. You move like aircrew." Pete didn't respond, focusing on the jammed release mechanism. The restraint had twisted during the impact, and the normal release wasn't functioning. Pete would have to manually bypass the system, something he'd done before under combat conditions when aircraft had taken damage. Working quickly but carefully, Pete used his multi-tool to access the restraint mechanism and manually release the pilot. It took several minutes of precise work, while Thompson gritted his teeth and fought off shock. "Almost there," Pete said. "When this releases, I'm going to need you to help me get you clear of the controls." "Roger," Thompson replied automatically, the pilot training taking over despite his pain. When the restraint finally released, Pete helped Thompson extract himself from the damaged cockpit and move away from the aircraft. The pilot's leg was injured but not broken, probably torn ligaments and muscle damage that would heal with time. By the time Pete had gotten Thompson clear of the wreckage, the first responders had arrived. Paramedics took over care of the patient and began assessing the pilot and flight medic. Firefighters started working on the fuel leak and securing the crash site. Police began directing traffic and taking statements. Pete stepped back from the activity, his job finished. He was covered in aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and dirt. His coveralls were torn in several places, and he had cuts on his hands from working with the twisted metal. But all three occupants of the helicopter were alive and would recover. The patient was stable, the pilot was walking, and the flight medic had only minor injuries. It could have been much worse. As Pete started to walk back toward his garage, someone called his name. "Pete. Pete, wait up." He turned to see Jake Martinez jogging toward him. Jake had been one of the first people to arrive at the crash site, drawn by the commotion like everyone else. But unlike the others who had stood around unsure of what to do, Jake had watched Pete work. That was incredible," Jake said, slightly out of breath. "How did you know how to do all that?" Pete shrugged. "Mechanical problems. Same principles." But Jake wasn't buying it. He'd seen enough to know that what Pete had just done wasn't basic mechanical knowledge. "Come on, man, that was professional level stuff. You moved like you'd done it before." Pete studied the younger man for a moment, Jake's expression wasn't mocking or condescending like it usually was. It was curious, maybe even respectful. "We all have experience," Pete said finally. "What kind of experience?" Before Pete could answer, Thompson, the pilot, approached them. He was leaning on a paramedic but insisting he could walk. "I wanted to thank you," Thompson said to Pete. "That extraction, you knew exactly what you were doing. Where did you learn that?" Pete was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the chaos of the crash scene continued. Paramedics loading the patient into an ambulance, firefighters finishing their work, police taking statements from witnesses. But Pete's attention was focused on the two men in front of him, both waiting for an answer he'd spent 15 years avoiding. 160th SOAR, Pete said quietly. Jake looked confused, but Thompson's eyes widened immediately. Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Pete nodded once. Jesus, Thompson breathed. The Night Stalkers, you were aircrew? Flight engineer, 3 deployments, Afghanistan, Iraq. Pete's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. Jake was still lost. "What's the 160th SOAR?" Thompson answered without taking his eyes off Pete. "Elite helicopter unit. They fly special forces into places where nobody else can go. If this man was with the 160th, he shook his head. That explains everything." "Explains what?" Jake asked. "How he knew exactly how to handle a downed aircraft, how he stayed calm under pressure, how he knew which systems to prioritize." Thompson turned back to Pete. "How many extractions did you do?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "Enough." It was then that Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at Pete's elbow. She'd been watching from across the highway and had finally worked up the courage to approach. "Pete," she said softly, "you never told me you were a hero." Pete looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm not a hero, Mrs. Rodriguez. I just did what anyone would do." "No," Thompson said firmly. "What you just did wasn't what anyone would do. That was professional, trained, expert-level work. You saved our lives." Word was spreading through the crowd of onlookers. People were starting to look at Pete differently, whispering among themselves, pointing. The quiet mechanic who'd been fixing their cars for 15 years had just performed a flawless aircraft extraction that had probably saved 3 lives. Jake was staring at Pete with a mixture of amazement and embarrassment. "All this time, we thought, I said things." "Doesn't matter what you said," Pete replied. "You didn't know." "But we should have known," Jake said. "We should have asked. We should have shown some respect." Pete shook his head. "I didn't want you to know. That was the point." "Why?" Thompson asked. "Why hide something like that?" Pete looked at the damaged helicopter, then back at the crowd of people watching him. For 15 years, he'd successfully avoided this kind of attention, this kind of recognition. He'd built a quiet life where nobody asked questions about his past or expected him to be anything other than a mechanic who fixed their cars. But now that life was over, the secret was out, and there was no going back. "Because," Pete said finally, "some things are better left in the past." But the past, Pete was learning, had a way of catching up whether you wanted it to or not. By the next morning, word had spread throughout Millbrook about what Pete had done. Mrs. Rodriguez had called her sister, who'd called her neighbor, who'd posted about it on Facebook. Thompson had given an interview to the local news station, praising the local hero who'd saved their lives. Jake had told everyone at Henderson's Auto, and from there, the story had spread to every garage, diner, and barbershop in town. When Pete arrived at his garage at 7 a.m., there were already people waiting for him. Not customers, just townspeople who wanted to shake his hand, thank him, ask him about his service. Pete nodded politely, said as little as possible, and tried to get to work, but it wasn't the same. It couldn't be the same. Around noon, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot of Pete's garage. Pete looked up from the engine he was working on and felt his stomach tighten. He recognized the vehicle type, the government plates, the way the passenger scanned the area before getting out. The man who approached was wearing a suit but moved like military. Maybe 40 years old, fit, with the kind of bearing that said he was used to being in charge. "Pete Peterson?" the man asked. "That's me." The man showed his credentials. Department of Defense, some kind of liaison office. "I'm Major Collins. I understand you were with the 160th? Pete set down his wrench and straightened up. "Long time ago." "Not that long. I've been reading your file. 3 tours, Bronze Star, Air Medal, Commendation Medal, flight engineer on some of the most classified missions of the war." Pete didn't respond. He'd learned a long time ago that when government officials showed up asking questions, it was usually better to let them do the talking. "We've been looking for you," Major Collins continued. "After you separated from the service, you kind of disappeared. No forwarding address, no contact information, no veteran benefits claims. It's like you didn't want to be found." "I didn't." "Why?" Pete looked around his garage, at the familiar tools, the half-finished repair jobs, the life he'd built in this quiet corner of the world. "Because I was tired." Major Collins nodded as if he understood. "A lot of men come back tired, but they don't usually disappear completely. They stay in touch with their units, their fellow veterans. They file for benefits, get help with transition, stay connected to the community that served with them. I'm not most men." "No," the major agreed. "You're not. The men in your unit spoke very highly of you. Your commanding officer said you were one of the best flight engineers he'd ever worked with. He also said you blamed yourself for the Kandahar incident." Pete's hands stilled on the wrench he'd picked up. He'd been waiting 15 years for someone to bring up Kandahar. "It wasn't your fault," Major Collins said quietly. "The investigation was clear. Equipment failure, not crew error. There was nothing you could have done differently." "Tell that to Rodriguez and Chen," Pete said, his voice barely audible. "Rodriguez and Chen knew the risks when they signed up, same as you. They wouldn't want you carrying their deaths around for the rest of your life." Pete was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. They were stained with oil and grease now, but he could still remember how they'd felt that day in Kandahar when he'd tried desperately to fix a hydraulic failure that couldn't be fixed, to save an aircraft that couldn't be saved. "Why are you here?" Pete asked finally. "Because we need experienced people. The 160th is expanding, taking on new missions. We could use someone with your background and expertise." Pete shook his head. "I'm done with all that." "I can see that. But your country isn't done with you." "My country has plenty of young men and women who can do the job. They don't need a broken-down mechanic." Major Collins smiled slightly. "Broken down? You just performed a textbook aircraft extraction under emergency conditions. Your muscle memory and training are intact. Your decision-making under pressure is flawless. If anything, you're better now than you were 15 years ago because you have civilian experience to go with your military training." Pete didn't answer. He couldn't explain to this man that he didn't want to be better, didn't want his skills to be sharp, didn't want to be the kind of person who could save lives under pressure. He wanted to be ordinary, invisible, forgotten. "Think about it," Major Collins said, handing Pete a business card. "We're not asking you to deploy. We're asking you to train the next generation. Pass on what you know to kids who are just starting out. Help them survive what you survived." After the major left, Pete stood in his garage holding the business card. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of Millbrook continuing around him. Traffic on the highway, the distant sound of the diner's lunch rush, kids playing in the park across the street. But something had shifted. The careful anonymity he'd built was gone, replaced by recognition he'd never wanted. People knew who he was now, what he'd done, what he was capable of. There was no going back to being just another mechanic, but something had shifted. The careful anonymity he'd built was gone, replaced by recognition he'd never wanted. People knew who he was now, what he'd done, what he was capable of. There was no going back to being just another mechanic. That evening, as Pete was closing up the garage, Thompson the pilot returned. He was walking with a slight limp but otherwise seemed fine. "How are you feeling?" Pete asked. "Sore, but alive, thanks to you." Thompson looked around the garage. "This is nice, quiet, peaceful." It was. Thompson smiled. "Word gets out, doesn't it? About who you really are. Seems to. I've been flying for 20 years. Commercial, medical, some military contract work. I've seen a lot of emergency responses, a lot of people trying to help in crisis situations. What you did yesterday, that wasn't luck or natural ability. That was world-class training and experience." Pete didn't respond. "The thing is," Thompson continued, "there are people who could use that training. Young pilots, new aircrew, emergency responders. You could teach them what you know, help them be better at their jobs." "Someone already made that suggestion today." "Military?" Pete nodded. "What did you tell them?" "That I was done." Thompson studied Pete's face. "Are you? Done, I mean?" Pete looked around his garage again, at the familiar tools, the comfortable routine, the life he'd built. It was a good life, a quiet life, a safe life, but it was also a life built on hiding from who he used to be. "I don't know," Pete said finally. Over the next few days, Pete's garage became an unofficial gathering place for people who wanted to talk to him about the rescue. Customers lingered after their cars were fixed, asking questions about his service. Other veterans stopped by to share their own stories and thank him for what he'd done. Local news reporters called asking for interviews. Pete handled it all with the same quiet patience he brought to engine repairs. But inside, he was struggling. The life he'd carefully constructed was unraveling, and he wasn't sure how to stop it, or even if he wanted to. It was Jake who finally forced the issue. The young mechanic showed up at Pete's garage on a Saturday morning, not with a work problem, but with a question. "I've been thinking about what happened," Jake said without preamble, "about how you knew what to do, how calm you were, how professional everything was." Pete continued working on the transmission he was rebuilding. "It's done now." "But it's not, is it? I mean, you're still here, still the same person who did that extraction. You didn't stop being who you are just because the emergency ended." Pete looked up at Jake. The younger man's expression was serious, thoughtful in a way Pete hadn't seen before. "I've been doing this job for 5 years, Jake continued. "I thought I was pretty good at it. But watching you work, seeing how you approach that situation, I realized I don't know anything. Not really. You know enough to fix cars, but I don't know enough to save lives, and that's what this is really about, isn't it? Fixing things so they work properly, so people can depend on them, so they're safe." Pete set down his tools and really looked at Jake for the first time. "What are you getting at?" "I want to learn from you, not just the mechanical stuff, the other things. How to stay calm under pressure, how to think systematically, how to prioritize when everything is going wrong." Jake paused. "I want to know what you know." "Why?" "Because someday I might be the only person around when something bad happens. And if that day comes, I want to be ready." Pete was quiet for a long moment. He could see something in Jake's face that reminded him of himself at that age. The desire to be competent, to be useful, to be the kind of person others could count on when things went bad. "It's not easy," Pete said finally. "I didn't think it would be." "It changes you, learning how to handle crisis situations, taking responsibility for other people's lives. You can't unknow it once you know it." Jake nodded. "I understand." Pete studied the younger man's face, seeing determination and genuine desire to improve himself. It reminded Pete of something his old commanding officer had told him years ago. "The best way to honor the people who trained you is to train someone else." "All right," Pete said, "but we do this properly. No shortcuts, no casual lessons. If I'm going to teach you, you're going to learn it right. Jake's face lit up. Really? Really? But I'm warning you, this isn't just about mechanical skills. This is about mindset, about discipline, about taking responsibility. You sure you want that? Yes, sir. Pete almost smiled at the automatic sir. We'll start Monday. Come in an hour early. As Jake left, Pete found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Major Collins. Maybe there was a middle ground between completely hiding his past and returning to active military service. Maybe he could use what he knew to help people without putting himself back in harm's way. That evening, Pete called the number on Major Collins's business card. "This is Pete Peterson," he said when the major answered. "I've been thinking about what you said. And I'm not ready to come back to the military, but I might be interested in teaching. Civilian emergency responders, maybe some private contract work, training people how to handle aircraft emergencies." There was a pause. "That could work. There's a real need for that kind of expertise in the civilian sector. I have conditions. I'm listening. I stay here. I keep my garage. Any training I do has to work around my existing commitments." "Understood. And no publicity, no interviews, no ceremonies, no recognition. I do the work and go home." Major Collins chuckled. "I think that ship has already sailed, Pete, but we can keep the government involvement quiet." After hanging up, Pete walked outside and looked at his garage. The sign still said Peterson's Auto Repair, and he was still going to fix cars and help the people of Millbrook with their mechanical problems. But now he was going to do something else too. He was going to make sure that the next time someone needed help in an emergency, there would be people ready to provide it. 6 months later, Pete's garage had become something unique. It was still an auto repair shop, but it was also an unofficial training center where local emergency responders came to learn advanced extraction techniques, where young mechanics learned not just how to fix engines, but how to think systematically under pressure. Jake had become Pete's first official student, and he'd proven to be everything Pete had hoped for: dedicated, intelligent, and genuinely committed to learning. Under Pete's guidance, Jake had developed skills that went far beyond basic automotive repair. The relationship between Pete and the town had evolved too. People still brought their cars to him for repairs, but now they also brought their respect and their questions. Pete had become someone the community looked to for expertise and leadership, even though he'd never asked for either. More importantly, Pete had found a way to honor his past without being trapped by it. He could use his skills and experience to help people without returning to the life he'd left behind. He could be the person he'd been trained to be without sacrificing the peace he'd found. The helicopter crash had changed everything, but in the end, it had changed everything for the better. Pete still opened his garage at 7 a.m. every morning. He still wore the same oil-stained coveralls and worked with the same methodical patience. But now when people looked at him, they didn't see just another mechanic. They saw someone who had served his country with distinction, who had skills that could save lives, and who was willing to share what he knew with anyone dedicated enough to learn. And Pete had found something he hadn't expected to find again: purpose. Not the desperate, high-stakes purpose of military service, but the quieter, more sustainable purpose of helping his community become stronger and more prepared, of making sure that when emergencies happened, there would be people ready to respond. Jake often asked Pete about his time in the military, and Pete had gradually become more willing to share some of those experiences. Not the classified details or the traumatic memories, but the lessons he'd learned about leadership, about staying calm under pressure, about the importance of training and preparation. The thing about being ready, Pete would tell Jake during their training sessions, is that you hope you never need to use what you know. But when the moment comes, and it will come, you'll be glad you took the time to learn. Mrs. Rodriguez still brought her ancient Buick in for oil changes, and she still told Pete to take care of himself. But now she also told him how proud she was of what he was doing, how important it was for someone like him to be part of the community. Pete Peterson never asked to be a hero. He never wanted recognition or thanks or admiration. All he wanted was to fix engines and live quietly in a small town where nobody knew his story. But sometimes the world doesn't let you hide from who you really are. Sometimes circumstances force you to use skills you'd rather forget, to be the person you trained to be, to step forward when others step back. Pete's story reminds us that heroes aren't always the people who seek attention or demand recognition. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones who do their jobs without fanfare, who carry their experiences without complaint, who are ready to help when help is needed. They're the mechanics who know how to extract people from crashed aircraft, the teachers who never mention their military service, the janitors who could run Special Forces operations, the ordinary people with extraordinary backgrounds who choose to live ordinary lives until extraordinary circumstances require them to be something more. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like Pete? Someone who seemed ordinary until circumstances revealed their true capabilities. Someone who carried hidden skills and experience, waiting quietly for the moment when they would be needed. Share their story in the comments. Tell us who they were and what they taught you about quiet strength and hidden heroism. And if this story touched you, subscribe to The Human Stories. We're here to remind you that extraordinary people are everywhere, living ordinary lives, waiting for their moment to matter. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about the people who demand to be noticed. They're about the people who choose to be overlooked until someone desperately needs them to be seen. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.